So we're going to talk today about Squadron Leader Brian Lane, DFC, whose story absolutely inspired me from a very early age. On the 21st of September 1940, official Air Ministry photographer Stanley Devon, who was also an award-winning pressman, went to Duxford to photograph Douglas Bader and 242 Squadron, and Bader took the wing up for him and Devon went up in a Blenheim. Also took some photos on the ground of 242 and 310 Squadron, and then went to RAF Falmere, the Duxford satellite, where he took a reel of film of 19 Squadron Spitfires, and 616 Squadron had a flight there as well. And these photographs are absolutely iconic. And amongst them is this one, the famous one of George Unwin, Brian Lane, Farmer Lawson, after that sortie, which was an uneventful patrol, actually. The wing patrolled over London. But he's 23 years old, and you can see the strain in his face. It's an iconic photograph. The amazing thing is that Stanley Devon, I don't think, realised what an iconic photograph he'd taken, because it's not mentioned. In fact, the visit to Falmere isn't even mentioned in his memoir. He does talk about having been and seen Bader at Duxford and flown with the wing, and what he was hoping to film was actually combat, but there was no combat that day. I really don't think he appreciated what an iconic photograph that is. Now, when I was growing up in the 1960s, I remember seeing that photograph frequently, and it was often used to illustrate articles in the Sunday magazines annually when it was sort of September time, Battle of Britain Day, but it never said who the pilot was, and it fascinated me. All it said was sort of Spitfire pilots making out their combat reports, or some generic sort of caption. And I always wondered, even as a very young child, who this man was. Well, some years later, I happened across this book, which was by Squadron Leader, it says, B.J. Elan, you see. And inside it said that the pilot was reported missing. And there he was, Brian Lane, you see. And I found out that B.J. Elan, and that's actually Brian's personal copy, by the way. We'll come back to that long story. So I found out that Brian Lane was his real name, and I started piecing the story together. And if you read the book, because it was subject to the wartime censor, there's lots of blanks about the names and the places and all of those sort of details that might have been helpful to the enemy. So first of all, I had to piece all that together. But of course, this would have been mid-1980s. And of course, I had the benefit then of access to the 19 Squadron records and the pilots' combat reports. And the greatest thing, of course, was the survivors were still alive. So via my old friend, Wing Commander Pat Hancock, who was Honorary Secretary of the exalted Battle of Britain Fighter Association at the time, I was able to communicate with the pilots in the book. People like George Unwin. Sadly, Jack Lawson was reported missing in 1941 or 42. And through these people, talking to them, came together this amazing story of this absolutely exceptional young man. So just to talk about Brian's story, he went to St. Paul's School, he took a short service commission in the RAF, and in the late 1930s, he was flying Gloucester Gauntlet biplane fighters with 66 Squadron at Duxford and then 213 Squadron at Wittering. Now, the Gauntlet was a biplane. And at the time of the Munich crisis in September 1938, that was the RAF's frontline fighter, whereas the Germans, of course, had got the Messerschmitt 109 monoplane. So this is not great. Fortunately, the Hurricane had already entered service, and the previous month, in August 1938, 19 Squadron received the first Spitfire. And over time, Squadron Leader Cousins introduced the type to service without losing a single pilot, which was quite an achievement. So by September 1939, Brian Lane's flown Hurricanes by then. 213 had converted to Hurricane. But he was then promoted to flight lieutenant and given command of 19 squadrons, a flight at Duxford. Now, you will often hear Brian Lane being referred to as Sandy Lane, and I really wish people wouldn't do it. And if they read my book, they would know why. Because as Frank Brinsden, who was a New Zealander and a flying officer on the squadron at the time, explained to me, there was a lot of bad feeling on 19 when Brian was promoted into the squadron. They thought that the vacancy for the flight commander should have been filled internally. So he was treated a bit coolly at first. And Sandy Lane was a bit like Muddy Lane, Sandy Lane. But Brian's personality, he was a quiet, almost intellectual. Gordon Sinclair described him as, but he was equally, as George Unwin said, a quiet but compelling leader. And the main thing about him is he was such a human being, if that makes sense. Fred Roberts, who was his armourer, was absolutely in awe of him. And that at a time when it was a very hierarchical social structure in society, and that was reflected by the services, but Brian knew everybody on the station, on the squadron, by first name, regardless of rank or status or role. He wasn't just a snobby officer, as John Mills said, who was his flight brigadier. So his personality soon won everybody over, and from that point on, the Sandy bit was dropped. And as Frank said, he was forevermore simply Brian. So that's the story about Brian Lane going to Duxford. Now, an interesting thing is before going to Duxford and 19 Squadron, he'd been flying with another pilot from Wittering to Northolt in a Miles Magister communications aircraft to go on leave. Unfortunately, he lost control of the aircraft crashed, and on Brian's person was a silver cigarette case, which was a present from his parents, got his initials on it. And it was damaged in the accident. They were nearly killed, and they were in hospital for a while, actually. But they walked away from it just, which is how he's written it up in his logbook. And the silver cigarette case was dented, and on the back he scratched 11th of the 11th, 38, which was the date of the prang, and the serial number of the aircraft. Now, that silver cigarette case comes back into our story, so just hold on to that. So now we've got Brian Lane, flying Spitfires, very popular flight commander. The squadron's commanded by Geoffrey Stevenson, who was a Cranwellian, close friend of Douglas Bader's. And in fact, Bader was in Brian's flight, actually, for a while when he returned to the Air Force, which was difficult because Bader was the big hero, older than the others, 30. Very, very difficult serving under Stevenson. So Bader managed to get himself appointed as a flight commander in Tubby Mervigan's 222 Squadron. But nonetheless, Brian Lane was his flight commander for a while. So anyway, we then get to the Dunkirk evacuation, or at least the fighting in France, the Blitzkrieg. And on the 21st of May 1940, Brian gets married to Eileen Ellison, who was a socialite, a blonde beauty, a pre-war racing driving champion on the European circuit. And there weren't many females doing that at that time. But that's against the backdrop of the fall of France. And on the 26th of May, 1940, 19 Squadron fights its first full formation combat over the French coast. Peter Watson is shot down and killed. Later in the day, Irwin is reported missing, Sergeant Irwin. Michael Lyne is shot up and crash lands on the beach at Deal. But in that first combat, Squadron Leader Stevenson was shot down and force landed on the beach at Saint-Gap, where he was captured. Ends up in Colditz with Bader at the end of the war. But after Stevenson's loss, Brian led the squadron in the air. And 19 was actually involved in Operation Dynamo and the air cover for it throughout, flying from Hornchurch. And what happens is, Air Vice Marshal Parr, commander of 11 Group, is dealing with a situation that's unprecedented. And he has lots of squadrons, up to 5 squadrons, flying together in convoy. Now, this isn't really a wing, because what people don't understand is, I don't think, that the limitations of airborne communications at the time meant that a pilot could speak to ground control and to the pilots of his squadron, but not airborne pilots of other squadrons. So a wing, in the sense of the wings from 1941 onwards, there was no cohesion. The commander in the air couldn't control it. So what Keith Park was doing was getting his fighters from A to B in strength, where they could then patrol and meet the enemy in strength. There was always going to be reinforcements close by. But the point about this is, Brian Lane and 19 Squadron were invariably at the head of these convoys. So by the end of the Dunkirk fighting, Brian, who'd become an ace, was probably, at 23 years old, one of the most experienced fighter leaders of the time. And at that time, people like Douglas Bader was a flight commander, way back. So it's astonishing that he got so much experience so soon, which is recognised with an early and very well deserved Distinguished Flying Cross. However, Brian doesn't get command of the squadron. Next on the list, career officer, Squadron Leader Philip Pinkham, AFC, who'd formerly flown gauntlets himself and was then in training command down at St. Athan, teaching Czech pilots actually how to fly Hurricanes. So Pinkham gets command. And the difficulty that Pinkham has is 19 Squadron has now been given the experimental Spitfire Mark 1B cannon Spitfires, which there are all kinds of problems, and that's for another video because it's an interesting story. But trying to get the cannons to work properly and introduce them into the Spitfire and into service, was Pinkham's big headache. So while Pinkham is dealing with that, again, it's Brian who's leading the squadron in the air. Now, the squadron's in 12 Group, and the brunt of the Battle of Britain, which is starting now, it is going on over the southeast and the south coast and over the Channel. So being in 12 Group, they're a bit out of the way. And then when they do get into action over the Thames estuary area, the problems with the cannons keep jamming. It's very, very frustrating for pilots. And so it goes on. And then 19 Squadron is part of the 12 Group Duxford Wing, which came about because of Bader's theories, all of that for another time. And Brian is leading the squadron all the time. 5th of September 1940, Pinkham flies his first combat sortie, and he's sadly shot down attacking a formation of Dorniers over Kent, bails out, parachute doesn't open, and he's killed. So at that point, Brian is formally given command of 19 Squadron. And as he said, it was a sad promotion, but nonetheless, he was the man for the job. And this then sees Brian through the Battle of Britain, commands the squadron right the way through the winter of 1940, and his logbooks endorsed exceptional, which happens rarely, and he is so highly thought of. It's unbelievable. This very, very young man. And in June 1941, Brian gets posted to the Middle East. Now, it was interesting what was happening out there in the Western Desert. You've got a lot of very, very experienced officers out there, gifted people like Billy Burton, Howard Burton, who commanded 616 in the Battle of Britain, Cromwell Sword of Honour winner in 1936. These people are out there to organise the Desert Air Force and to organise and learn close air support for ground troops, Army Air Cooperation. That's what they're out there for. And Burton actually goes on to be the shining star of all of that. But Brian became ill and the climate didn't suit him at all, so they sent him home. But when he came home, he did a Spitfire refresher course at Redmond in Shropshire and was then sent to Ludham in Norfolk by Hickling Broad as a supernumerary squadron leader to gain operational experience under the current conditions before taking command of another squadron himself. So 167 is a Dutch squadron, and they've got the Spitfire 5C, the cannons have now been introduced, and what they're doing are these rather pointless sorties across the North Sea, seeking targets of opportunity. They flew very low over the sea, so as to not be detected by the German radar, and then pop up over the cliffs or whatever, and attack whatever they could find, whether that was trains, enemy troop movements, gun emplacements, anything at all. Although, as my old friend Ron Rayner, DFC, who was on 41 Squadron in the Taylor win time, Barder time, 1941, as Ron used to say, how did we know if we shot a car up whether it wasn't the local doctor on his round? So it was all a bit pointless. And going over the sea, a long flight both ways, on a single engine, risky anyway, and a lot of people were lost in 1941, 42 on these absolutely pointless exercises. Really experienced people like Bob Stafford-Tutt, like Eric Locke, Paddy Finnegan. It's pointless. And Brian leads this section of 4 Spitfires over the Dutch coast. The flak is intense, but they managed to bypass the flak and get away with that. Then they're intercepted by 2 Focke-Wulf 190s. And Brian's not met the 190 before. And by this time, the 190 holds sway. As Air Vice Marshal John Jolson, a top scoring RAF pilot in the war, said to me, it reduced the radius of our penetration to the coast. Pushed us back to the coast, the 190. And, we couldn't do anything with it, with the Spitfire 2s and the Spitfires. It just outclassed everything. And Brian was last seen, as the Spitfire split up, he's last seen on the tail of a 190 heading inland. Now, after a long flight like that and stooging around looking for targets over the Dutch coast, they're low on fuel, these Spitfires. They've really got to beat it and get home. And it's obvious what's happened because the other 3 Spitfires get back to Ludham and Brian fails to return. And I can only imagine that what's happened is he's chased the 190, and then at some point, because he's been unable to catch it, he's had to turn around and head for home. And it's at that point that the 190 has then got on his tail, shot him down off Shervan Island, and he's gone into the North Sea, never to be seen again, leaving behind young Eileen as a widow. Well, it's a terribly sad story, and he was 25 years old then, 13th of December, 1942. So what he left behind was the book Spitfire, which at least gave us account of that Battle of Bredunker and Battle of Britain period. Very similar to something like David Crook's Spitfire Pilot or Widge Gleed's A Rise to Conquer. It's that kind of book. And when you read it, there's nothing intellectual about it. I mean, it is written by a very young person, if you like, talking about their experiences. And it's all written in the sort of style that the war's a jolly jape, really. But it's a fantastic account. It really is. And what I wanted to do was republish the book in its original form, but then with a second part that told the actual story through the official documents and through the words of the pilots who were there. So, and this is when I started tracing the 19 Squadron survivors. So this would have been probably mid 1980s, I suppose. And it just so impressed me. You've got people like Wing Commander George Unwin, who was a tough miner's son, a Yorkshireman, a regular Royal Air Force, not a reservist or auxiliary, a tough NCO. You used to call him the High Priest of 19 Squadron. And, these are really professional airmen. But they absolutely loved Brian Lane. And George flew with Brian a lot. As he said, I was his wingman. We were friends, but because I was an NCO and Brian was an officer, we were segregated on the ground, so we never socialised. And that's part of the subculture of the time. But what really impressed me, you've got people like George, Jimmy Jennings, another sergeant pilot, DFM, AFC, in the end, also retired as a wing commander. Brian was shot down by a hurricane on the 11th of November, 8th of November 1940, and crash landed at Eastchurch Airfield. And Jimmy James followed him all the way down, refused to leave it. Again, couldn't speak highly enough of him. Frank Brinsden came over from New Zealand. Oh, and Brian, you know, when my turn came to lead, I modelled myself on Brian. Big time. David Cox, another sergeant pilot, a reservist. Coxey landed the Spitfire and the undercarriage collapsed, and Squadron Leader Pinkham put him on a fizzer and endorsed his logbook in red, which Coxey was very upset about. And Brian Lane, he went to Brian Lane with this, who was his flight commander, and Brian Lane sort of took the matter on, and he even took it as far as Supermarine and worked out that there was a problem with the undercarriage system. And eventually, and I think it was even after Brian had left 19 Squadron, this was all resolved. And the red endorsement in Cox's logbook was struck out. And David Cox was saying it was an absolutely extraordinary thing that, you know, he had such a sense of right and wrong and injustice that he pursued that to the extent that he did for a humble, if you like, sergeant pilot. And what was most impressive was when you got these very distinguished fighter pilots together, and there'd probably been about 70 then, I expect, perhaps a bit more. Whenever Brian's name was mentioned, bearing in mind he was killed when he was 25, the decibels. Oh, Brian, what a placement Brian was. You know, if he'd have survived, he would have definitely finished with air rank. Oh, Brian, you know. And it impressed me so much, these people who had led such distinguished lives and accomplished and successful lives themselves, felt so much respect and still felt that sense of loss, of losing this exceptional fighter pilot, fighter leader, and human being. I thought it was extraordinary. I discovered that his widow, Eileen, sadly died prematurely of cancer in 1972. But she lived with, but not married, a chap called Owen Fargus. And they lived in the Channel Islands. And they travelled all over the world, South Africa and all over. But I traced Owen and contacted him because I was very interested to know what had become of Brian's family, his medals, you know, and all of these bits and pieces. His logbooks, by the way, are in the National Archives, so anybody can go and look at them there, and they're brilliant because he's written them in quite some detail. It was his diary, really, when he wrote his book from, and they're punctuated with photographs and everything. So if you ever go to the National Archives, have a look at Brian's logbooks. It's a real treat. But yeah, so Owen said, the only thing I've got is this silver cigarette case that Eileen always had, because when Brian's mother was dying in a nursing home in Middlesex, we visited her and we gave her all of his memorabilia, all of his medals and photographs and bits and pieces. The only thing that Eileen kept was the silver cigarette case. So he lent me the silver cigarette case for an exhibition, a Battle of Britain exhibition that we put on in Worcester for the 50th anniversary. And when the exhibition was over and I made contact to arrange the return of this precious item, I found out that Owen had actually died. He'd been overcome by fumes working on his Daimler in his garage, and he died of carbon monoxide poisoning. So I wrote to the executors and said, well, look, this is really tragic news, and the silver cigarette case is really historically valuable because, as far as I can tell, apart from Brian's logbooks, it's the only personal item to do with this extraordinary and exceptional young man that survived. So the actual owner of it was Owen's nephew, Henry, And he said, well, you can curate it for us then. And, you may be able to use it and display it and so on and so forth, which I did from time to time over the years. And I had it for 30 years, I suppose. But this was the first book, my first ever book, May 1990, launched at the RAF Museum with all of the surviving 19th Squadron Battle of Britain pilots, which was amazing. But I decided that 30 years later, I was going to completely update it with this paving slab of a book, which covers the 19th Squadron period, 1938 to June 41, when Brian left. A big chunk of chapter in there about Brian's last flight. Probably, I don't know how many photographs, must be 300, I would think, collected from the pilots and the ground crews and what have you. But when I'd finished that book, and the book came out in the summer of 2019, I sort of thought, well, my journey telling Brian's story and recording Brian's story, it's done really. I've got nothing else to say. Everything I've got to say about Brian and what an exceptional man he was, and how all of the people who knew him wanted me to write that story and tell a story. All of that is in here. And for years, that silver cigarette case had sat on my desk to inspire me while I was writing, searching, and so on. And I thought, well, I think the time's come now, a bit like Bilbo Baggins and the ring in the Lord of the Rings, I suppose, that the time's come for the case to go on another journey. So I spoke to Henry, and we decided that the best place for it to ensure its long-term preservation was the Imperial War Museum at Duxford, which was 19th Squadron's home station. So in October 2019, on Henry's behalf, I presented the case to Craig Murray, the curator at Duxford, who accepted it on behalf of the Imperial War Museum. So it's now part of the National Collection, and therefore has the same level of preservation as Nelson's topcoat at Trafalgar, can you believe? And if you ever go to Duxford, please go to the refurbished operations room, and there you will see that the case is displayed, along with actually some other 19th Squadron personalisers. I think they've got Gordon Sinclair's black pre-war flying suit with his Dolphin 19th Squadron badge, and Jimmy Carr's logbook and things like that. But the silver cigarette case is there. And it's not just me who is sort of inspired by Brian's story. A friend of mine, Paul Baderman, lives in Middlesex, in Pinner. And when he found out where Brian was from, 19 Barrow Point Avenue in Pinner, which is where Brian grew up, Paul arranged a brilliant service in 2013 and arranged a blue plaque at the house. So that's up there as well. And it was unveiled by Ken Wilkinson, who was the last surviving 19th Squadron Battle of Britain pilot, and John Milne, who was Brian's flight rigger, who absolutely worshipped the man. Sadly, they're both deceased now. But that was a really wonderful event. That was. I really enjoyed that. And even now, most recently, and I'm not sure how you say this, I think it's Coteray, or Coteray. It means kingfisher in Maori, I think. And it's a new model company based in Auckland, in New Zealand, owned by Mark Robson and his general managers, Richard Alexander. Great chaps. I was in Auckland earlier this year. We met up for a beer and a meal. It was great. But I've worked with them to produce these really high-tech 1/32 scale plastic Spitfire models. And there is one that's recently come out, which is Brian's, with the great picture of Brian on the box. Superb model. Really superb. And so it goes on. And videos like this, they go out on the internet, they go, they're going to be on YouTube, and it's all about sharing the story. And I think, I think the job is done. I think Brian is cast in stone, if you like, and he's missing. He's remembered on the Runnymede Memorial. There isn't really much more we can do. We've tried to do our best for you, Brian, and for all the guys, all of them that I knew. I do miss them. I knew them as friends. one other thing is that 19 Squadron has now been rebadged. It's a non-flying unit, an aerospace battle management unit, so dealing with all the quick reaction alerts, fighter control, surveillance, really modern, massively high-tech stuff. The squadron is acutely aware of its heritage and the legacy of Brian Lane and so on, and what they've got to live up to. And I was up there at RAF Bournemouth for the 108th anniversary due at the end of August, and then spoke to the squadron, addressed the squadron about 19 Squadrons, Battle of Britain and Brian Lane, and was pleased to present Wing Commander Graham Crow, the OC, with a model of a 19 Squadron Spitfire built by my son James. And it was great to do. And now in the ops room there is the Brian Lane floor and the George Unwin floor. So isn't it amazing that 23 years old, George was older, George was 27 in the Battle of Britain. These inspirational people, they can live on, and they'll live on forever. So I think it's great. And thanks for listening. Brian Lane has definitely been a big inspiration to me, and one of the things that's underpinned my work always. So I'm very happy to share that with you all. Thank you.